Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we'll talk to Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Siarto and former Pentagon official Jim Townsend as part of a big picture discussion about NATO and the potential for a second Donald Trump administration, which would mean a renewed focus on getting European countries to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. We'll also dive into the latest threats from ISIS and a stunning new Pentagon report on UFOs. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined here by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Guy, it's good to see you. We've made it to week number 3 here at the Threat Status podcast. How are you, and what got your attention over the past week?
Ben, it's good to be with you. There are a few things that have been in the U.S. NatSec focal lens at the moment, but not necessarily making major headlines. It was notable that U.S. Army General Michael Kurilla, the head of the Pentagon Central Command overseeing all American military operations in the Middle East, suggested in testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee on March 7 that the Islamic State terror groups, Khorasan affiliates in both Afghanistan and Syria, have been regrouping. He said that they've got the capability and the will to carry out attacks with little to no warning, most likely against U.S. assets and or allies in Europe. Interestingly, that warning came just before the U.S. Embassy in Moscow put out a warning that some kind of a terror attack targeting crowds of people in Russia might be imminent. That is notable because the U.S. Embassy warning came right after Russia's own FSB intelligence service claimed to have killed several Islamic State followers in Russia that were plotting an attack, allegedly, on a synagogue there.
Not a coincidence that all these things are happening in essentially a 24-hour period on opposite sides of the world.
We're certainly trying to figure that out. Another development in recent days saw Coast Guard ships from the Philippines get crashed into by a Chinese ship in the disputed South China Sea. The Philippines is in a major territorial dispute there with China, and it's particularly tied to great power U.S.-China jockeying because remember, the Philippines is a major U.S. military treaty ally in Southeast Asia, and apart from the tension between China and Taiwan, the Philippine-China naval tensions are pretty combustible right now. It's on my radar.
Look, I think it's on my radar, and I think it's on everybody's radar, especially after President Biden's State of the Union addresses. It's hard to believe this is happening, but I guess it's official now that we're getting a Trump-Biden presidential contest rematch in November, and it's a rematch that, judging by the polls, nobody wants to see, except maybe Kim Jong-un. We could take a second just to review some comments made by Robert Manning, a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center, who spoke at the Washington Brief recently, an online forum sponsored by the Washington Times Foundation, and argued that perhaps Kim wants to see a second Trump term, so maybe he can resurrect diplomacy with America and possibly get a deal that lifts economic sanctions on his country. Look, let's be honest about one thing here. Whatever you think about Trump, his temperament, the way he treats people, strictly from the foreign policy perspective, he shook things up in a way that few presidents really have in recent years. And it reminds me, Guy, of the Frank Underwood quote from House of Cards, that if you don't like the way the table is set in front of you, turn the table over. And that essentially was Trump's foreign policy, I think, in a nutshell during his first term in office. Maybe you think that's good. Maybe you think it's bad. But look, the decision to meet with Kim was a huge deal, and it effectively turned over years of U.S. foreign policy with respect to Korea. He also started negotiations with the Taliban for a deal that ended with the U.S. military withdrawal, which, of course, ended up being a disaster in the way it was carried out. But nevertheless, that was a huge step that seemed unthinkable just a few years before. Maybe we'll see that again. I'm curious, Guy, do you think there's any other areas where maybe Trump could turn the table over, perhaps with NATO? Could we see something to that effect in a theoretical second Trump term?
I personally think that what Donald Trump has been saying about NATO is often overhyped in the American media. It's hard to read whether he is just trying to stir up European allies to spend more on defense, or if he's talking about flipping the table over and changing the U.S. posture completely. I do think it's oftentimes he says things and it gets mischaracterized or over. There's quite a bit of a hysteria about it, but nonetheless, it's worth watching very closely, and it's watched very closely in Europe. And NATO politics are actually a major topic in our discussion with Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Siarto. Before we go into the discussion, Ben, I want to offer a little context. I sat down with Siarto at the Hay Adams Hotel across the street from the White House while he and Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban were making a brief stop in Washington before heading on to Florida, where they were going to a dinner with former President Trump. Prime Minister Orban is a major fan of Donald Trump and wanted to meet with him following Trump's big victory on Super Tuesday. Remember that Hungary is a member of the European Union. Hungary is part of NATO, but under the government of Mr. Orban's Fidesz party, it's a very conservative party. It's often in great tension with the EU and EU elites, and really the European left, which criticizes Orban, saying he's cracked down on media, free speech, that he has violated EU norms with regard to rights for LGBTQ and other minority groups. At the same time, Hungary is kind of an example of how little tolerance that the rest of the EU has for autonomy on the part of conservative or populist governments that are member nations of the European bloc. Finally, I think it's important to note that Hungary has maintained close energy relations with Russia, while pretty much the rest of the EU has severed those ties, even though Hungary stands with NATO on the side of Ukraine against Russia's invasion, albeit without shipping weapons to the Ukrainians the way other NATO nations have. Some of this comes up in the interview with Peter Siarto. Let's get to it. Mr. Foreign Minister, tell me a little bit about the goal of your visit in the States right now.
The Prime Minister has come to have a meeting with President Trump. You know that we had the best ever political relationship between the two countries during the first term of President Trump. And we have a clear commitment to improve our bilateral relationship to the level where they used to be between 2016 and 2020. And we all know that we only have the chance for that improvement in case President Trump returns to White House. So it's going to be an exciting meeting between the two leaders to speak about how to make peace in Europe and how to improve the bilateral relationship between the two countries.
And so no meeting with the Biden administration on this visit?
No.
Let's talk a little bit about peace in Europe and NATO specifically. Hungary is consistently among the nations that spend well above the 2% threshold. What do you say about the U.S. pressure on countries like Germany, Italy, France to spend more and get up to the 2% threshold, as well as former President Donald Trump's remarks on this?
It was more than 10 years ago that we have made a commitment in Wales that all of us in the alliance would exceed the 2% mark when it comes to defense spending compared to GDP. So this is a commitment to which all of us are or would be obliged to comply with. And 2023 was the first year when Hungary succeeded to hit this 2%. And there's another precondition as well, which is the 20% spending of the defense budget on development. We have been complying with that for long years now. So I think it is with good reason that President Trump or any other US president calls or urges the European member states of NATO to comply with this commitment or with this obligation. So,
Do you think the Germans could do it if they wanted to?
well, for some reason, they have committed themselves as well. If they had been aware that they would not be able to do so, I'm pretty sure they would not have committed themselves to this 2%. So, I mean, physically, it should be possible for everyone.
Part of former President Trump's remarks that gained kind of global media hysteria was this idea that if others didn't pay up, the U.S. would perhaps shrink its own footprint within NATO. Would NATO be able to have the unity and strength that it has if there were a smaller U.S. footprint?
Now, I mean, obviously, the smaller the U.S. Footprint is in NATO, the less strong we are, no question. So a lot depends on the U.S. level of the U.S. participation in NATO activities. I remember the first NATO summit President Trump has participated, and there he had a list, and he read it out. And this list was about the defense spending of the allies, and just a few of them have complied with the 2% commitment at that time. So I understand the U.S. president to be sensitive on this matter, given the fact that U.S. spends way the most financial assets on
Per
defense.
capita, they're actually beat by Poland right now, right?
Yeah, well, Poland has performed always very well in this regard. I think it has a historic reason, but Poland definitely does perform well. But the United States is definitely the leader of the pack in this regard. So I understand their sensitivity on that.
Why was the Orban government perceived to be standing in the way of Sweden's ascension?
Look, the government has always been supportive to the ratification. We have already submitted the draft to the parliament more than 1.5 years ago. The reason why the parliamentarians decided not to put this issue on the agenda for a long period of time was that they felt to be insulted by the Swedish politicians who have constantly, really constantly criticized, accused, attacked Hungary, challenging the democratic nature of our parliament and of our political system. So our parliamentarians had a dilemma that parallelly to the Swedish politicians accusing Hungary for not being democratic, they have been urging our parliamentarians to vote in favor of their accession. So they said, look, we need some, let's say, rebuild of trust. And the Prime Minister of Prime Minister Orban has worked together with the Prime Minister of Sweden to rebuild that trust, which was finally successful. Swedish Prime Minister visited Budapest. The extension of a security cooperation agreement has been signed, so there was no more obstacle. The parliamentarians found the trust to be rebuilt, and they have voted in favor of the accession.
Let's talk about this political fight or ideological fight between Fidesz party and the EU, and the way that it's kind of spilled into Hungary's relations with NATO. The Orban government has also spoken out against Secretary General nominee Mark Rutte, a Dutch prime minister, very much an EU establishment character. If Mark Rutte becomes Secretary General, will Hungary continue to stand with NATO?
Well, of course, we will always stand with NATO, but I mean, it would be a very harmful way of selecting the Secretary General in case there is no consensus among the allies. And you know, it's obvious that we cannot support the election of Prime Minister Rutte, given the fact that he was very unfair towards Hungary. He even said that Hungary should be pushed on its knees. Now, after such a statement, how would you expect a country to support such a person to become Secretary General of the strongest defense alliance of the world? So it's impossible.
Let's get to the Ukraine war. How does this end? Is it possible to mediate a solution at this point? What is your view, given your proximity to the war, compared to where we are in Washington?
Look, we have been living in the neighborhood of the war for more than 2 years now. We have been confronted with the consequences. We have received more than 1 million refugees. We have been carrying out the largest ever humanitarian operation of the country, and so on and so forth. So we are pretty sure that Ukraine cannot win this war against Russia, as Russia is now gaining ground and pushing the front. But in the meantime, Russia cannot win the war against the West either. So since none of them can win, therefore this war will be ended by negotiations for sure. The question is when these negotiations will be started, sooner or later. And the sooner they will start, the more lives will be saved.
In the interim, do you think the U.S. should be doing more to aid Ukraine militarily?
Look, we are the only NATO member state which has not been delivering weapons to Ukraine. Because we understand that the more weapons are being delivered, the longer the war will take and the more people will die. I think efforts should be made in order to make peace and not to escalate the war.
You're also in a position somewhat stuck in the middle where Hungary probably has the most robust energy relations with Russia at this point, given the severing of Russia-EU relations otherwise. Is that why Hungary has resisted arming Ukraine the way other NATO states have?
Now, first of all, we have not delivered weapons because we do believe that instead of weapon deliveries, efforts should be made in order to make peace. This is our principled position. When it comes to our energy cooperation with Russia, we always spoke very clearly that we are not ready to sacrifice the security of the energy supply of our country for a war which is not ours. And since the gas deliveries are not falling under the sanction regime, and since we got exemption from the sanctions on oil, it is absolutely legitimate or legal that we buy these sources of energy from Russia. But in the meantime, here the U.S. administration put pressure on us to cut the nuclear cooperation with Russia. But in the meantime, we understand that the Russian Federation became the #1 supplier of the United States when it comes to uranium. So while the United States is buying a record amount of nuclear fuel from Russia, we got pressure from Washington, to cut our nuclear relationship with the Russians. So there's a big hypocrisy. And for us, energy security is nothing that we would make compromise about.
Thank you so much for joining us, Foreign Minister Siarto.
Thank you so much.
Fascinating discussion, Guy. And now let's get a different take on NATO, where the alliance goes from here now with Sweden and Finland having officially joined, and what the possible resolutions could be of the Russia-Ukraine war. And we're joined now by Jim Townsend. He's an adjunct senior fellow in the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Jim spent 35 years in the Pentagon, finally as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy. Jim, it's great to talk to you as always. I know, previously when you and I have talked over the years about the Russia-Ukraine war, you've always been a rather optimistic voice. I know that's changed a little bit recently for you in the past few months. How would you describe things for Ukraine right now? Is it hopeless, or is there still a chance you think they could turn this around?
One thing I've learned, just having worked through so many conflicts over the years, is it turns out never the way you think it's going to turn out. You think about last year, and you think 2 years ago when the war started, the assumptions that the Ukrainians are going to be rolled right over by the Russians, and the Russians were going to be in Kyiv in a matter of weeks. I mean, everyone was saying that, intel community here, and it was just the conventional wisdom. And there was nothing really for most people to hang on to that would make them think anything else. And I had colleagues, though, who knew Ukraine pretty well, and they were saying, don't sell these guys out yet, that they are, hard fighters, et cetera. And sure enough, they really surprised us, and they particularly surprised the Russians. So it's now time for Ukraine to reset. And they're going to probably have to take much of this year to go through more training, to have arrival some of the equipment that's been in the pipelines, and deal with this ammunition shortage that is not just the U.S., but coming out of the European Union as well. This year is going to be one where it could be a bit of a crossroads where let's see how quickly the Russians recapitalize their military. Let's see how quickly there can be a Ukraine reset. Will we end this year kind of where we started this year? I don't know, but I do know that we're in it for the long haul. We got to be in it for the long haul.
Couple of questions, Jim, about NATO. And of course, we just saw recently Sweden officially join the alliance. Finland, of course, joined. So on one hand, you've got, NATO, just by the pure metrics, by the numbers, is stronger than it was when Vladimir Putin launched this war. He certainly wasn't expecting that. So you can say over here, okay, NATO is stronger, it's bigger, it's more capable than it was 2-3 years ago. On the other hand, we have a presumptive presidential nominee in the Republican Party and Donald Trump, who sounds as hostile as ever toward NATO, and we'll see how the election shakes out in November. So you've got sort of those two opposite ends of the spectrum here.
One thing that Putin has done, which was a strategic error, and I don't know if he even cares or not. He's focused on Ukraine, but what he did was he made the alliance stronger, or potentially stronger. For sure, it's stronger in terms of Finland and Sweden coming into the alliance, as you pointed out. That really has locked up his northern flank. And that's tough for Russia because their northern fleet is up there. The northern fleet is now having to deal with NATO right on their border. And also Sweden and Finland both bring in a very, very capable military, which is important. NATO really has gotten his act together in terms of military plans. NATO, for lots of different reasons, since the end of the Cold War, they didn't do a lot of military plans because we were building a Europe whole, free, and at peace. We didn't have a Russian enemy until recently, if you will. And so they have actually gone back to brass tacks and have put together regional plans for the defense of the alliance territory. I haven't seen them myself. They're classified, but from all of my friends and contacts there, they really are saying the alliance, really, the NATO military authorities have really outdone themselves in terms of a military plan. The bad news is that, yay, we got great plans. The allies are struggling to fill their arsenals and get the ammunition needed to include stuff for Ukraine. So it's going to be a race. It's going to be a race.
That's a great segue, because I want to ask you, and maybe this pops into my head because I just happen to be reading a couple of books about World War II right now, but I'm just curious in terms of Europe, building up its defenses. Germany in particular. Trump, of course, hammered Germany for years. Spend more in defense. Spend more in defense. You spent years, decades working with NATO, working with European countries. I'm just curious, is there a reluctance amongst some countries in Europe for, say, Germany to build up its military to the point where it's a historic power that could maybe go toe-to-toe single-handedly with Russia if it needed to? Because, in history, sometimes that hasn't necessarily turned out all that well for Europe. Is that reluctance there that maybe some countries like a Poland say, hey, there's a reason why we haven't wanted a country like Germany to have such a strong military over the past 75 years?
Well, I will say that people kid around about that. It's kind of the old gallows humor at NATO, and the earlier, people were saying that, isn't it ironic? And the German people themselves, they're quite reluctant as Germans to want to have a large military, to be spending a lot of money on military things. Tanks, once again, in Ukraine, Leopard 2 tanks are in Ukraine. My God, so it's not just the nations of Europe thinking, wait a minute now, but it's also the German people saying, what's going on here? And I think, frankly, the German people particularly have had to work through this, and the German government. Actually, they've had to do that since the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, Germany was quite militarized. The German army was very large, aircraft and tanks. And so I think they got over that militarization during the Cold War days. And then during the 90s and onward, they fell back into this. We're just a middling European country, and we're interested in being good Europeans, not armed to the teeth. Now they're having to deal with this expectation that the nations have that Germany will help lead the effort to get the European nations and the allies back in the mode where they can defend themselves, and so they're having to do that. And the other allies are pushing them too, because they realize that at the end of the day, it's going to be up to Germany. And so I think, other than wags who like to make a joke at the bar about the German panzers, I think most have moved on, and they're now telling Germany, you got to get your act together. We are, and now you need to do it as well.
Do you think NATO countries, and look, I hate to generalize because every country has their own internal politics and considerations, but do you get the sense that NATO as a whole, and the majority at least of countries within it, do they want Ukraine to join? If we could snap our fingers right now and say, okay, Ukraine's a NATO member, would they want that? Of course, we don't know if Putin would have launched his invasion if Ukraine were a NATO member, but if it were today, that certainly introduces a lot of other complications in terms of collective defense and what NATO's responsibilities would be. So in a moment of truth, if they were at the bar, as you say, do you think they want Ukraine to be a member of the alliance right now?
Well, it's mixed. The three Baltic nations, Poland, Romania, I think those nations who have came out of the Warsaw Pact or came out of the Soviet captivity, as the Balts did, those nations who know Russia and are on the front lines want very much for Ukraine to come into NATO, because they don't want Ukraine to lose, because they will be next. And they are very concerned that Ukraine win, even if that means bringing them into NATO right now. But the further south you go, and the further southeast you go, Ukraine and the war there and Ukraine membership isn't quite as the top of the agenda as it is the closer you get to Russia. And so those nations feel that there is still work that Ukraine needs to do with corruption, with governance, other things, agriculture policy, as we've seen with the Polish farmers and others. There's a lot of work that both within the European Union and within NATO, bringing in Ukraine with all of certainly its capabilities, but also its issues, is something you don't do overnight. And so there are some nations that eventually want to see that happen. But they feel that Ukraine's not ready, and maybe the EU and NATO aren't quite ready yet.
Jim, thank you so much. Fascinating discussion. Pleasure talking to you as always. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been great.
All right, and now it's time for the threat of the week. This is a weekly segment where Guy and I both identify a threat, whether it's domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is threatening you, the listeners, threatening all of us, threatening U.S. interests and our allies anywhere in the world. So, Guy, what's your threat of the week?
There's so much going on, but I'm going to go with the prospect of a resurgence of Islamic State inspired or affiliate groups in Syria or Afghanistan, given the warning by the Pentagon Central Command Chief in recent days about the Khorasan affiliates in both Afghanistan and Syria, that they've been regrouping and that they have capability and will to carry out attacks in the coming months. That just wasn't on my radar. I mean, always it is on my radar, but it wasn't the way that it suddenly is now, because there are a lot of things that Central Command can talk about when it goes up on Capitol Hill in Washington, and the fact that was chosen to be highlighted is usually indicative that there's a lot of back channel intelligence floating around, because that's a forum for it to become public.
My threat of the week, a little bit different, but it's UFOs, and specifically the wild claims and allegations that are made around UFOs and about alien spacecraft, extraterrestrial life, and whether the government may have inadvertently opened a Pandora's box. There's a remarkable new report just a few days ago from the Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, essentially their UFO investigative unit inside the Defense Department. And it reads in part, Guy, almost like a government-sponsored episode of Mythbusters. It just goes line by line to refute some of the more seemingly outrageous claims we've heard over the years. They tested material that a UFO research group said came from an alien spacecraft. The government said it was just a manufactured terrestrial alloy. They interviewed people who said they'd seen actual evidence of reverse engineering of UFOs. The government said they found no proof. They interviewed private companies, presumably defense contractors, who allegedly had been working on reverse engineering programs. They said they found no evidence. For a UFO buff like me, this is pretty fascinating stuff. The fact this report exists at all is amazing, but is it dangerous? Is there a point where the government, in what I believe is a good faith effort to address these questions and rumors, are they actually adding more fuel to the fire and fueling conspiracy theories? Are they legitimizing claims that could erode public faith in the government? Is there anything that would convince the skeptics out there? Probably not. In the long run, I wonder whether this report and congressional hearings that have given a public voice to some of these seemingly wild accusations, does that do more harm than good? In short, Guy, I wonder whether this report, in a roundabout, inadvertent way, actually represents a little bit of a threat to the American public's faith in their government.
Totally interesting questions, Ben. Everything that's come out of the Pentagon about UFOs in the last 5 years has been incredibly interesting because it's reshaped the landscape of conspiracy theories about UFOs and undergirded certain things with fact, but it's also led to more questions about how much more intelligence is there, and just the idea that it's a real issue that American national security resources go towards. It's pretty interesting stuff.
It's amazing. And when you see just the volume of information that's included in this report, that's the volume of information released publicly. That's unclassified, declassified. So you know, anybody can tell you whatever's here on the surface that's been declassified, there's a mountain underneath that remains classified. And you're right. So it's going to just fuel more questions. But Guy, you and I will get into all of these questions in the weeks to come here on the Threat Status Podcast.
Yes, we will, Ben. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for listening. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and Guy and I will be back next week for the next episode of the Threat Status Podcast.